Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communication.
Ro, did you have a nice Mother's Day weekend? I sure liked being able to actually celebrate Mother's Day with my mom in person.
That's right. You drove down in your case to San Jose. And how's the family?
Everybody's good. We had a very nice, enjoyable day, and it's nice that everybody is double vaxxed, and we could have had a little semblance of normalcy for this Mother's Day. And looking on my social media, it seems like just about everybody did that too.
My brother and sister-in-law came over, and so did my niece. We're all double vaxxed except for my niece, who's she's on the young side, 20, so she's only got one vaccination down. But it was all lovely, and we're so happy to be able to get together again. So this week's podcast, we're fortunate to have probably the most prominent transportation policy thinker in the country, Robert Poole. Bob is with the Reason Foundation. He's Director of Transportation Policy. And Tim and I discussed with Bob all things transportation. And it's especially timely because the so-called infrastructure debate continues to dominate the news. So now President Biden has called this infrastructure plan, as Bob points out, the quote, American jobs plan. Well, last week we got the April jobs report, and it was a real shock to economists nationwide and even to Wall Street. The country created only 266,000 jobs. The expectation was that the U.S. would create over 1 million jobs in April, aren't actually there.
Well, I think what's interesting when you dive into this issue of jobs and unemployment and getting our economy back on track. I read a great column this morning by Jim Garrity in National Review, and he underscores the point that many economists have been making, that people are actually making more money not working than they would be if they were back in the workforce. You know, we have this extra unemployment benefits on the books that in some states it's as much as $300 a week, and that expires in September. Well, some states are actually taking action to end those extra unemployment benefits early to kind of push people into the workforce now. The Garrity column, he says here that in February, this is data from the Federal Reserve, country had 7.36 million job openings. Compare that to 4.6 million in the height of the pandemic in April 2020. And the NFIB reports that 42% of the small business owners they surveyed had job openings that couldn't be filled. So it's kind of a conundrum, you know, how do you help people but yet nudge them back to work?
Just to put this $100 a week bump into context for people's unemployment checks, if you annualize these numbers, in New York, that means an annual income of about $57,400. And in California, it's $54,600. Now, so we are actually paying people to stay home, and $55,000 is a pretty good sum to stay home. And another issue I think from this jobs report is that the average hourly earnings, it looks like they actually ticked up, to your point, Tim, because normally they wouldn't tick up if we had an anemic jobs report. But it looks like employers are having to pay workers more to return to their jobs. And so now mom and pop businesses are having to compete with Uncle Sam, who's offering huge incentives not to work.
It's interesting, in the Garrity article, he quotes a restaurant owner from West Virginia, and he says, I feel like I'm competing against the enhanced unemployment benefits and the stimulus. It's making it hard to find workers when they can make so much not working. I'm sure, especially for restaurant owners, you know, that's a big issue. One of the things that has been discussed is because we're having this trouble competing, there's a commentator I saw who made the comment on Twitter last night, well, you should just pay them more if that's the issue. Well, they are paying more. They are offering more money. You know, that's the marketplace at work. It's still not attractive enough to compete with what they're making not to work.
Well, and also President Biden last week, along with Secretary Yellen, used these numbers to show that quote, we've still got a lot of work to do, in the economy. So pass this infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan. Well, the fact is that the provisions in this plan don't really kick in right away. They're for outlying years. And so this quote unquote investment doesn't really affect the current job situation.
That's right. So it really, kind of makes you wonder, what are we doing here? Is this really helping the economy and really helping people in need? Or is this more making good political points? And it seems like we're making good political points much more than we are helping the economy or those who are really struggling.
Yeah, and in California, we've even got bigger problems than the nation. The state's unemployment rate is persistently higher than the national average. Right now, it's about 8.3%. You can compare that to the recent 6.1% for the nation. And I gotta believe it's because the kids are still out of school for much of the state. So parents, a mother particularly, can't go back to work if she has to care for her kids who are going through Zoom school.
That's right. And are we really going to be back full time to school this fall? It all makes it very difficult. Then you have childcare issues, and the importance of safely kind of getting back to normal can't be underscored more.
So I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of this podcast. As I mentioned earlier, Robert Poole is a renowned transportation scholar and really wrote the book on market-based solutions for our nation's transportation needs. And also definitely listen to the end because he's got some great beer recommendations. So for a little commercial before we go, we just want to remind everyone to save the date for our gala dinner, October 2nd at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco. Our keynote speaker is Mark Levin, and we're also celebrating our president, Sally Pipes' 30th anniversary at PRI. And now that the country is starting to open, Sally's also going to be speaking about healthcare in Phoenix. So if you're in the Phoenix area, she'll be there May 25th. We're partnering with our colleagues at the Goldwater Institute for a panel discussion on healthcare. So please come by if you can. You can register for both events at pacificresearch.org. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Bob. So we're delighted to have you on to talk about an issue that's at the top of the agenda in Washington. That's infrastructure. President Biden recently proposed what he's calling his Build Back Better plan, a $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan paid for by massive corporate tax increases. So to start off, what's your initial impressions of the Biden plan? And in your view, is the Biden plan, as some people say, light on infrastructure and heavy on pork projects?
Well, actually, it should not be called an infrastructure plan because infrastructure is at best about 20% of the total $2.3 billion. It's really a jobs plan, which is actually what he calls it, the American Jobs Plan. And it's aimed at creating huge numbers of good union jobs and union work rules and so forth, making the cost of whatever infrastructure does get produced a lot higher than it needs to be. But there's also, I'm really disturbed that it builds in a lot of social programs that will be fine for the 8 years in which there's new federal money, but then it's going to be after 8 years of people getting used to these new social programs funded by that. It'll be almost impossible politically to turn off the spigot then. So this is a terrible thing. Infrastructure investment should be big one-time things that are not creating ongoing obligations, but I think the plan is misnamed, and I think it's very, very disappointing.
So as is the case with a lot of the policies being discussed by the Biden administration, we've really been there, done that here in California, and it seems like a lot of what's being talked in the Build Back Better plan resembles what we've done here in recent years. Then that's repairing existing roads and highways while shortchanging adding lanes or other congestion relief. So based on your research, what should be the priority for road and highway infrastructure funding in the coming decades?
Sure. The near-term priorities really should be, first of all, more express toll lane on congested urban freeways, because those actually give a choice to drivers to be able to pay when it's worth it to them to get a faster and more reliable trip. And they also provide a much superior alternative for region-wide transit by having buses use uncongested lanes across the whole metro area instead of spending umpty-ump billions on rail transit, which has very limited in what it can actually do. So, and that's the number one short-term priority. Little longer term, the interstate highway system, which is the most important infrastructure we have in this country, is wearing out. A major report from the Transportation Research Board that was asked for by Congress on the future of the interstate said the pavement is now in most places 40 to 50 years old, in some places 60 years old, and really needs to be rebuilt from the subsurface upward, pavement torn up and replaced. And a lot of the corridors don't have enough lanes for the future of growth. We have about 100 bottleneck interchanges around the country to increase congestion, pollution, and so forth. And they're trying to handle twice the amount of traffic that they were designed for. They need to be redesigned, old ones torn down and replaced. The minimum cost of this is about $1 trillion over the next 20 years, according to this big TRB report. And there's no mention of any of that in the Biden plan, unfortunately. The roads and bridges, I suspect this is going to be an anti-highway program rather than a highway program. The amounts of money sound big until you look at how big the actual problems are. A lot of it, the money is supposed to go on rebuilding or modernizing local streets. That may well be an invitation for this complete streets idea, where you take away lanes and make more space for bicycles and pedestrians and reduce the capacity of roads. There's a whole program for reconnecting neighborhoods, which looks like it's going to challenge the continued existence, not even just the widening, of urban interstates that were originally built 50 or 60 years ago through lower income neighborhoods, and disregarding that the interstate system is supposed to be for interstate commerce, and if you take pieces out of it, it isn't a network any longer. So there's a lot of things that really concern me about even the limited amount of money that is supposedly being spent or to be spent on roads and bridges in this plan.
To follow up on that, Bob, you recently wrote a piece noting that federal highway planners are failing to ask a key question in planning funding priorities for the coming decades. What else needs to change? What are some of the areas that you think should be a bigger part of the discussion in planning for America's future highways?
Sure. Contradiction in the policies is that the administration and a lot of people in Congress think cars are bad because they pollute, including CO2. Therefore, we don't want to have more highways. We want to reduce highway capacity and force people to do other things. But at the same time, they're planning to spend billions, if not trillions, on promoting electrification of cars and trucks. So if they succeed, cars are not going to be bad. They're not going to be emitting CO2. And we're going to have, especially if we have autonomous vehicles in the next few decades, more demand for travel because cars will work better and be emissions-free. So it makes no sense to be at the same time phasing out petroleum-fueled cars and cutting back on highways when we're going to need more highways and people will enjoy them better once the vehicles are electric. But what else should be done? The other thing that is really getting a little attention, but not enough, is that because of the combination of federal fuel economy standards and the big push for electrification, which is going to get much bigger in the next few years, I'm sure, the current main funding source for highways, the per gallon gasoline and diesel taxes, are going to run out of steam and not be able to fund things. Part of this is because at the federal level and to some extent at the state level, a lot of those monies are being diverted already from building highways to paying for mass transit and sidewalks and all kinds of other things that politicians like because they think they'll get more people to say, oh, they did something good for us. So we really need to fix the funding system. And in my testimony at the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, I suggested a near-term fix for the Federal Highway Trust Fund would be to spend all the money that's coming in from user taxes on highways, the way it was originally. That's why it's called a highway trust fund. You were supposed to be able to trust the government that all the money that you paid in fuel taxes would be spent for better highways. There's almost enough money coming in to pay for the actual federal highway spending because 20 to 25% of it is siphoned off for all kinds of other things. It's only that makes it look like there's a deficit in the highway trust fund. No, it's because politicians are spending a lot of the money on other things. So that's a short-term fix. But longer term, we really need to switch to paying per mile rather than per gallon. And California has one of the early stages states doing research on this, getting into pilot programs and testing out the ideas, following the lead of Oregon, which was the first state in the country to do this. We're a long way from having all the answers on how to do this and when, but I think it's something that Reason Foundation has been supporting for a number of years. The need is really there. We are not going to be able to pay for good highways and the future highways that we need with per gallon fuel tax. So we've got to come up with something better.
You know, a very controversial subject is whether we should raise the gas tax to pay for road and highway infrastructure projects. Now, PRI's Michael Tom, in his recent study Nickel and Dime, argues, like you do, that switching to tax people based on miles driven could be a better way to ensure drivers pay for the roads they use. So paint the picture for us. What would a mileage-based tax system look like for drivers and taxpayers if implemented?
Well, I laid this out in my book that came out in 2018, Rethinking America's Highways. The idea in the book is that we should make the highways into something like utilities, where you get a highway bill, and the highway provider is you pay the bill to the highway provider, and just like with your electric company, the money doesn't go somewhere else. It goes right into the budget of the highway provider. This is how toll roads work in America, and it works very well. Toll roads are safer, they're in better physical condition, because in most cases they keep all of their revenue and reinvest it in proper maintenance and, when needed, rebuilding or expansion. I've laid out in a Reason policy study how a state could transition gradually to a mileage charge. And by the way, I think there's a huge difference between a tax and a fee. And I know a number of the advocates of making this switch call it a mileage tax. I would fight hard for it to become a true user fee that is paid either to private highway providers, like some of our toll roads are nowadays, or to state DOTs that operate the highways as a business, and the money is safeguarded to be spent solely, just like your payments to your water company or water agency or your electric company. It's done that way. There's a relationship, a customer-provider relationship that isn't there with the way we do highways today. And so this is a battle that's going to go on. Will this be done as a tax or a fee? And I'm putting my, maybe not bets, but my energy into arguing that it really should become a true user fee.
So, Bob, you've argued that as an alternative to massive borrowing or tax increases, public pension funds like CalPERS here in California could be a significant source of funding for critical road and highway projects across the country. Explain your thinking here.
Right. What public pension funds are starting to do, because they have huge unfunded liabilities, is trying to increase the return on investment in their portfolios. And infrastructure is one of the most recent diversifications that they're doing. They're looking for maybe an 8 or 9% return on their equity, as opposed to currently they're running more like 5 or 6%, which is not anywhere near enough to meet the obligations they have to retirees. So what they have started to do is create sub-portfolios of infrastructure investment. For example, CalPERS, which is the nation's largest public pension fund, bought 10% of privatized London Gatwick Airport about a decade ago. And later on, they bought into the public-private partnership company that is running and managing and improving the Indiana Toll Road, which is a long-term public-private partnership. So what they're looking for is revenue-generating infrastructure that is managed privately by a private company that they can invest in. So it's not that they're directly investing in say, rebuilding 101 in California. They're looking to invest equity in companies that have long-term public-private partnership agreements with governments and are responsible for investing to rebuild, expand, modernize highways and charge the customers directly. So there's no free lunch here. It's not that pension funds can just dump money in. They have to get a return on investment. The way they get a return is because the particular kinds of infrastructure, airports, tolled highways, seaports, have revenue streams that can provide a return on the equity that the pension funds want to invest. Australia and Canadian pension funds got into this decades ago and have global portfolios of infrastructure investments, they typically have about 10% of their portfolios invested in revenue-generating infrastructure. In the United States, it's probably less than 1% so far, because this is still a relatively new phenomenon for the pension funds. But I think there's a lot of potential in it.
You've also written extensively on the important role that public-private partnerships can play in transportation infrastructure projects, such as toll roads. So how would expanding the use of public-private partnerships be a better deal for taxpayers while still ensuring that critical road and highway projects are built?
Right. Well, the mechanism is called a revenue risk long-term public-private partnership, meaning that it does inherently involve charging the customers for the services they get from the highway. Around the country, about a dozen of the express toll lane projects that have been added to congested freeways are being done as long-term public-private, we call them P3s, public-private partnerships. And most of those have achieved investment-grade bond ratings. The P3s, they're funded by a combination. Typically, equity investment from pension funds or infrastructure funds is about 20 to 30% of the initial cost of building the new capacity. Most of the rest is debt, like revenue bonds. The returns, the revenues that come in, need to be enough to pay the debt service on the bonds and to hopefully provide a return on the equity investment. In a number of cases, so far this is still relatively new. The state DOT has to put in maybe 15% or 20% to make the numbers come out right. But it's still, if the DOT is putting 20% in the project, that means they're leveraging their own limited money. They're getting 5 times the value for the amount that they're putting in, because the rest of it is being covered by the equity and debt backed by the toll revenues. So this is a way of really, as state DOTs are increasingly strapped for funds, in part because the fuel tax is not generating so much, leveraging their liberty and funds through public-private partnership. And as long as people are willing to pay tolls, which is always a political challenge, but if there's new capacity that's delivering something better that they otherwise wouldn't get, I think there's some pretty good survey data showing that people are willing to pay for better services, new capacity that offers them higher quality, if that's really if they really can get it from that. And that's what we're seeing around the country. Virginia, Texas, Florida, to a limited extent Colorado, are among the leading states that are using this mechanism so far. And Pennsylvania is trying to do so. They have 10 good-sized bridges on their interstate highway system that need to be replaced, and they've proposed doing it with long-term public-private partnerships with tolls on these are currently non-tolled bridges. And they're getting big pushback in the Pennsylvania legislature from Republicans who say roads should be free, and this is it's such nonsense. There's no tooth fairy bringing you new roads. Somebody has to pay. It's either going to be taxpayers or the customers. And I think increasingly it really needs to be the customers. People really need to learn what highways cost and be offered ways to pay that cost.
Bob, in a recent piece, you quoted Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who said that in addition to repairing highways, we must also account for climate change and make it a priority to fund high-speed rail. It's likely that, the Biden plan will probably get through Congress in some form using budget reconciliation. Do you think California's beleaguered high-speed rail project will finally get the federal funding lifeline it's been trying to get for years?
I certainly hope not. $80 billion is about what they'll take total, or maybe more, but maybe more like $100 billion. And the total amount in the current Biden plan for intercity rail is $80 billion. And that is politically much more likely to be spread out among dozens and dozens of Amtrak projects, which is what the Obama administration did on a smaller scale. None of those projects produced any meaningful improvements in speed or ridership. And high-speed rail is ridiculous to being sold on a climate-friendly basis, because particularly in California, it will involve, if it's ever finished, massive amounts of tunneling, very huge, gigantic amounts of concrete and so forth, and the environment, the CO2 footprint of all of that construction, according to one UC Berkeley study, will take something like 70 years of operating savings recover to offset the carbon impact of building it in the first place. So the idea that this is some form of big environmental benefit is ludicrous. It's also a lot less expensive to add lanes to I-5 up and down the state of California for electric and autonomous vehicles of the future and for electric or hydrogen-powered trucks. So the case for this is completely bogus.
Now, along the same lines, you wrote that Congress and the Biden administration should take a closer look at the costs and results before taking the leap to boost funding for Amtrak or high-speed rail, for that matter. Now, we know we have our work cut out for us, given that President Biden is perhaps the nation's #1 fan of trains and travel by rail. So, what are some of these serious issues that Congress should look at before agreeing to tens of billions in dollars in additional rail funding? And what are some reforms that could be adopted to make America's passenger train services more self-sufficient?
Well, first of all, one problem from an environmental standpoint is that the vast majority of Amtrak trains are diesel. And diesels are fossil fuels, and they are not a very environmentally friendly solution. The alternative of electrifying the entire rail system nationwide so that Amtrak would be a cleaner, quote-unquote, alternative is trillions of dollars of cost. I mean, no one has seriously contemplated doing this. The other big problem with this is that we have, in contrast to Europe has a rail system that is optimized for passenger service. And as a consequence, trucks carry the vast majority of freight in Europe. Our mode share for freight rail, we carry about 40% of all our ton miles by train, as opposed and about the same for trucks. So we have a choice. You can't optimize a rail system for both. You have to optimize for one or the other. And if we make over the U.S. Current rail network for passenger service, it's going to really decimate the freight rail industry and mean that a lot more goes to trucks, which the enviros don't like. They like them even less than trains, railroads. So this is a real conundrum. I think the only viable role for intercity rail in the United States is of tourism, and I think people, if they want tourist trains, should pay the cost. I mean, I'm a big fan of tourism. I've ridden railroads all over the world, including the Rocky Mountaineer in Canada, which is a private profit-making company that pays to use the lines of the freight railroad. That is a way, but that's a very small niche market. That's not anything like the dreams of Amtrak. That's a first half of 20th century dream that was basically made obsolete by air travel and the interstate highway system, and there's no reason to bring it back.
Bob, the Rocky Mountaineer a train excursion is also on my bucket list, and I'd love to do that. That sounds like a fabulous trip.
You will love it.
So for our last question and our favorite question, we ask all of our guests to provide us with a wine or beer or cocktail recommendation. We call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's close proximity to wine country. And so what wine, beer, or adult beverage are you enjoying these days while you try to navigate the twists and turns of this infrastructure debate?
Thank you very much. I'm going to disappoint you, the wine country folks, because my beer of choice is fine German Rieslings, and so that's mostly what I like to drink. We just the other day had mango margaritas with fruit from our mango tree, and that's another real treat that I look forward to. I don't indulge that very often, but it's a great summer drink.
Thank you so much, Bob. This is very helpful and informative, and helping our listeners navigate through this infrastructure plan. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.